From the Weston A. Price Foundation, welcome to the Wise Traditions Podcast for wise traditions in food, farming, and the healing arts. We are your source for scientific knowledge and traditional wisdom to help you achieve optimal health.
Wise Traditions, Kate.
It is such a pleasure to be here, Hilda. It was so nice, too, to get to meet you in person before we ventured to do this.
And I liked you immediately. Number one, because we have common friends from the Larsons, but also because you have alliteration in your name, Kate Kavanaugh. And I like to go by Holistic Hilda. So I'm like, this girl, she's a woman after my own heart.
I love a little bit of alliteration.
That's awesome. So listen, I know you've had a lot of life and death experiences on the farm. And I want to ask you about what happened with your little goat last November. Let's kick things off with that story.
Yeah, I have this story about a goat that we raise some grass-fed goats for both meat and dairy here on our little farm in upstate New York. And I had a goat, his name was Texas, and he was not meant for the food system. He wasn't going to go into food production. He was just a goat that I had really bonded with and really grown to love. And he died in a tragic farm accident. And I think farmers will know that sometimes things happen that you couldn't have foreseen coming. And it's a little bit of a sad story, but I'll kind of tell you what it's led into for me. But he died in a tragic accident, and we had to make a decision about what to do with his body, whether or not we were just going to bury him or if we were going to put him in the freezer. And this is going to maybe sound a little foreign to people that might run farms, that would be the best way to honor his life. But for us, it really felt like a space where we could honor our relationship with Texas, and to allow him to nourish us into the coming months and the coming year. And we did. We butchered him. I am a butcher by trade, and it was a really beautiful act of intimacy. And something that I think a lot about is how intimate our relationship with food is, that what we perceive of as other, right? These things outside the boundary of our skin become us in this act of eating, where our digestive tract is actually outside of our body, right? It's continuous with your skin and from your mouth to your anus. And as we digest our food, the elements and vitamins and particles that make up our food diffuse across a one-cell wall-thick lining in our intestines, and they actually become part of us and part of this elegant conversation that's constantly happening with all of the environment around us. And this moment with Texas was a really big moment for me to explore that intimacy that we have with our food in a much deeper way, and intimacy with death in our food, as well as just to explore what that difference is between self and other and what it means to be nourished.
This is so fascinating already, Kate. And it's one thing I love about you is that you like to go deep. And I literally have not given much thought, and I'm a person in this space, I have not given much thought to how the food we eat becomes us. And it becomes a part of who we are.
Yes.
That is fascinating to think about.
Yes, and it informs, right? It changes us on an epigenetic level, right? What we're eating is a conversation with our environment, a conversation with our biology, even from the standpoint of breath, that every breath that we take in contains oxygen that was once a part of plant tissues, contains different microbes that will become a part of our microbiome. Every breath out, we exhale carbon dioxide that becomes, again, a part of those plant tissues. And so there's this constant act of transformation of matter that's happening within our food system, and this reciprocity and exchange and surrender with our environment.
You've already given me pause, and I don't think I ever want to eat a Dorito again because I don't want a Dorito to become me or me to become a Dorito.
Yeah, I like that thought. Yeah, that's a good extension of this thought process.
Oh, but beautiful Texas. And you're right. The idea that you would be honoring his body by allowing him to nourish you may really be foreign to some of our listeners right now who don't live on a farm, who
Absolutely.
don't give much thought to farming or homesteading or even butchering.
Yes, absolutely. And I think it was foreign to me. I grew up a city kid. I grew up a vegetarian. And so these were very foreign concepts to me that I have sought out because I'm really curious about this connection that we have with our food and the depth that we can find in that relationship.
So let's talk a little bit about how you, a city girl, a vegetarian, turned into this farming girl that's now a butcher too.
Yeah, so this was really an impetus of my health, and I'll keep my backstory pretty short. But when I was a teenager and I had been a vegetarian for almost 15 years as I approached age 20, I was experiencing a lot of different health issues. I don't think it's a very uncommon story, right? I had gastrointestinal issues, I had mood issues, and had fatigue issues. And I really wanted to find a different state of health. And I kept feeling called into meat. But I decided that if I was going to eat meat again after all this time as a vegetarian, that what I truly wanted was to be in connection with my food. And so I sought out these relationships with farmers and ranchers and became fascinated by our food system. This was almost 15 years ago now. And so the word regenerative wasn't even in the cultural lexicon. This was a different time, but those were the farms and ranches that I was seeking out that had these holistic land management practices. And the more I learned about our food system, the more I wanted to learn and to be a tangible part of that, to put my hands on it, as it were. And so I sought out an apprenticeship in butchery and became a butcher. It's probably 12 or 13 years ago. And then my husband and I opened up a small whole animal, so a little bit different than what you might see at the grocery store, right? We bring in the whole animal and we break down everything in-house, directly from farmers and ranchers with these holistic land management practices in Colorado called Western Daughters. And I've been a butcher for that time, and it dovetailed into farming and becoming a nutrition therapist and just wanting to explore in depth every component of our food system.
Well, I don't know if we'll get to explore in this conversation every component of the food system because
No.
it is this intricate web. But I do want to talk to you. Let's just start with the part about butchery.
Yeah.
Let's talk about some things that may surprise the listener and me and that maybe surprised you at first. I'm thinking about, for example, the fact that meat and fat shifts with the seasons. Can you tell us a little bit about that aspect of what you see in the animal when you go to process it?
Yeah, so one of the things I like to tell people about butchery is that it's this beautiful opportunity to see an animal's life and raising practices from the inside out. That you can see what they've been eating and that sort of phytochemical richness made manifest in the meat and fat of these animals. And it really shows you this relationship between what your food is eating and what your food ate, where and I think this is a perfect example of it when we talk about phytochemical richness, which we generally associate with fruits and vegetables, anthocyanins, and something like a blueberry. There are also these secondary compounds, something that Dr. Stefan Van Vliet calls the dark matter of nutrition. Fred Provenza has spent a lot of time looking at these secondary compounds as well, that are in plant tissues that actually go into animal tissues. And so carotenoids are a good example of this. We associate carotenoids with things like orange bell peppers or carrots, giving them that yellow color. But in different seasons, grasses will have different concentrations of these carotenoids and many other phytochemicals. And that will lend that sort of rich yellow color to fat. And you can see this shift throughout the seasons. And you can see this phytochemical richness in the meat and in the fat and the way that that animal is changing in relationship to its environment and what's happening in that season, just like we kind of opened with.
So when we see fat on a steak, let's say that we're eating, or I'm thinking of some lamb that I had in Mongolia, the more yellow it is, the more rich it is in the beta carotenes. Is that right?
Yes, but I do like to put a little caveat on this. Yellow fat is not indicative. It's associated oftentimes with a 100% grass-fed and grass-finished animal, that it will have yellow fat, and that grain-finished animals only have white fat. And in my experience butchering many thousands of animals, this is not true. It actually varies with those carotenoids that are present in grasses and can shift throughout the season and can shift regionally as well. So in the Northeast, you're going to see much yellower fat on grass-fed animals, and out west, it's going to be something that is largely seasonal, and there will be times where you see a whiter fat on these grass-fed animals.
So you can't really judge necessarily by the color of the fat what kind of grazing system this animal has been on.
No.
Okay, that's helpful. Now, I also noticed when I was prepping for this interview and reading some of your information is that you say, that was too long an intro, for example, I will cut that part out. I was like, I don't need that little line. I've also heard you say that butchering actually makes you feel more connected to the animals and the food system rather than less. Can you go into that a little bit, Kate?
Yeah, I think that we have been connected to our food, and food has been so much of a part of our daily life for most of human history. We are one of 40,000 generations of hunters, and we would have spent a lot of our time hunting and gathering and processing our foodstuffs. And I think that that leads to a depth of connection and relationship with that. And I think in the same way, butchery, and while there's a lot of sort of gatekeeping in the butcher world, I think that anybody with reverence for an animal and hope of doing their best can be a butcher. I don't think it's inaccessible. I think that it's something that's in our bones. I think that it gives us that connection with our food and also a connection with our own bodies. Every time I do a butcher demonstration, one of my favorite things is to sort of highlight that we have all of the same muscles. They just are organized differently, or to illustrate for someone where the diaphragm is in the body and to connect it back to this biology that we share with so many mammals and creatures here on Earth.
And that very thought, I think, makes some people feel uncomfortable, doesn't it?
Yes, I think that it is too close. It feels, I think we use the term too close to home to imagine that, and to then have that complicated thing where part of our food system is death. And that to look at that is to look at your own mortality, is to look at the way that not just sort of animal agriculture in the conventional setting and concentrated animal feeding operations have been obfuscated, but death has also been obfuscated, not just in agriculture, but in our world of hospice and hospitals, and we don't undertake our dead anymore. So that feels like a really a point in our food system that has a lot of tension and some fear and some reflection that's uncomfortable.
And maybe that's why we're more comfortable buying food, especially meat, in little styrofoam packages covered with plastic. It's kind of sanitized, isn't it? We don't see
Yes.
the blood. We don't see what the animal went through. We have no relationship with that animal at all.
No,
until we
it's
eat it.
very disembodied. Literally, it is disembodied. It feels like something that could have come from a pork chop tree. It has been absolutely reduced to this constituency of just being a piece of meat. And we don't consider the life it might have lived, the body that it came from, or in fact, the people and the hands that touched that meat along the way in the food system.
Now, because of all your studies, I feel like you have insights that perhaps not every butcher would have. For example, I know you understand a lot about the ratios of different nutrients in some of the meat, or especially when we consume the whole animal. Can you talk about that a little bit, Kate?
Yeah, absolutely. And I know you've been talking to Dr. Bill Schindler, and I think that Bill does a beautiful job of talking about this as well. But when we're looking at eating the whole animal, that includes the organ meats where you have this incredible nutrient density. As Bill puts it, like we begin to change a little bit as Homo sapiens when we have access to those organs because they are so nutrient dense. But I also think that one of the gifts that I've been given as a butcher is an opportunity to explore cuts from the whole animal. And this includes a lot more collagen, a lot more of the amino acid glycine that we associate with collagen. And I think we've moved into a space where we eat a lot of lean muscle meat. Probably not your listeners. I think
Right.
there's some knowledge out there, but where we eat a lot of lean muscle meat that's really rich in methionine. But when we go back to slow cooking and cooking these roasts and these cuts that you might not otherwise think about, things like, I think about my favorites, shank and chuck rolls, and I love a flat iron that has not had the tendon taken out, hasn't been denuded, where it's got that rich tendon in there, and to just slow cook it until that tendon turns to jelly, and giving us this perfect complement of nutrients. And I think that nature doesn't make mistakes, right? And we have been eating these collagen rich foods for a long time.
What were some of the cuts that you hadn't experienced before until you became a butcher and started realizing, oh my gosh, we should be eating the whole animal? Let me try this. Did you have trepidation?
I didn't. I think I was just so filled with curiosity. I jumped in with both feet. I wanted to experience everything, and I went after some of the cuts that are the least used in those initial years. That I wanted to try tongue, that I wanted to try shank, that I wanted to try tail, and that I wanted to make head cheese, and all of these different things that had never been a part of my diet, even my vocabulary. And those are still some of my most beloved cuts. But I also want to say this: the thing I cook the most at home is ground beef, because not only is it collagen rich, because you're getting some of those offcuts that are a little bit tougher and you're mechanically tenderizing them in the ground beef process, but it's also the most abundant. That's what farmers and ranchers have the most excess of. And it's also the least expensive. So we eat a lot of ground beef in our house.
Oh my gosh, I love me a good burger. I
Yeah.
love ground beef so much. And well, actually, we met at the Force of Nature event. I'm going to cut out this middle part, but I love it when it has organ meats blended in because
Yeah.
then I'm getting the benefits of that, more of those offcuts of the animal, but that are so nutrient dense, but they're mixed in with something I'm familiar with, so it tastes great.
Yeah, I love this. And I love the act of hiding little things in ground meat. I think it's a great way to go and a great way to get that nutrient density while still enjoying the texture and the flavor of something.
Okay, awesome. So around there, we'll have the mid roll. Okay, so now I'm going to pivot and ask you about a little bit about processing and stuff,
Yeah.
and maybe butcher shops. So, Kate, I was in Europe last fall, and in France, there were butcher shops on the corner. In different places I've been, there's actually open air markets. In Greece, there were markets with rows and rows of meat and fish. And why is this seen so little in the US?
Yeah, I mean, there's a long historical influence of why this is the case. And I think that, there's a real pivot point at a couple of different places. Number one, at the end of World War II, when we really start doing more concentrated animal feeding operations, and that begins to centralize the system. It begins to centralize processing, and it begins to centralize more of the grocery stores and consumer shopping habits. And then under Nixon, you have the Secretary of Agriculture, Earl Butz, who says get big or get out, really asking farmers and ranchers to grow and to consolidate. And that flows all the way down to our shopping habits. And we really lost this idea of butcher shops here in the United States, I think, earlier than most places. And it's something that you don't see as much, but I think that there has been a return to them to some degree in the last 10 years. See a little bit more on the East Coast, but there are some great butcher shops spread throughout the United States that are practicing this whole animal where everything is broken down in house as opposed to the grocery store or some other other butcher shops too, that order in cases of just the parts that customers want. So my favorite example of this is that you only have about a pound of hanger steak on an entire animal. And so to order a case of 40 hanger steaks, that's 40 animals worth of meat. So in a whole animal butcher shop, you have more constraints, but at the same time, you also have an opportunity for more creativity.
Well, and this takes me back to Texas, not the state, but your goat. I'm thinking you were honoring him too because you didn't want to waste him.
Yeah.
And in the US, in our dietary habits now, we've moved away from organ meats. We've moved away from honoring the whole animal, and we've moved toward boneless, skinless chicken breasts.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really important to note. And, you know, I mean, in this system, there's a lot of food waste, right? There's I think 30 to 40% of all food is wasted, just ends up in landfills anyway. But even the yields on butchery, and I want to say this with I love processors and I think they're amazing, but what we do at the butcher shop, we get higher yields on what we use and what we utilize. So it's about 87% of the animal compared to industry standard is 67%. And so really wanting to use each piece. I will say, not to push back on this, that the conventional system is excellent at efficiency. And so while they find places for all of that to go, it just looks a lot different.
So, can you explain the difference between like a butcher shop or a butchery and a processing plant?
Yeah, so everything that we butcher at the shop has already been killed, skinned, and gutted. Some butcher shops, and these words are kind of used interchangeably at times, where a processor or a slaughterhouse might also go as a butcher shop. But those are all terms for the process of you bring live animals in, and they are killed and skinned and gutted and then maybe turned into meat and steaks. And there are various sizes of these processors throughout the United States, from the very big, where they're going through 15 to 20,000 animals a day in 3 shifts, to the very small, where they're only doing 5, 10, 40, 100, right? So there's all different kinds of scales within that system.
So, I wanted to ask you about processing because I've gotten to know more and more farmers over the years, as you can imagine, and there seems to be some kind of backup or issue with processing. In other words, they have to transport their cattle or their chickens like miles and miles and miles away to get them, killed and
Yeah.
skinned and all the things you were saying. Why is that?
So just like we've seen consolidation in everything else, we've seen consolidation in processing. And so now you have these massive processors that are doing all of these animals, and that feed into, they're vertically integrated. They own every part of the system. And we've lost a lot of our smaller processors. And so you see these bottlenecks in farmers or ranchers that are having to book out processing dates 2 years in advance, which is absolutely wild. And processors that have closed in rural areas, I think we're seeing a need for them, certainly, right now. And there is a very big need, and they are such an important part of our food system. We talked a little bit about this before we recorded, but we don't often talk about our processors. We might wear t-shirts and hats repping our favorite farmers, but this little piece, and I think because it has so much to do with death, has just been tucked away and hidden and isn't something that we discuss as much.
Yeah, well, I'm glad we're talking about it now. And I think it's important to address right now the listener who may be like me, as a person who doesn't have land, doesn't understand why the bottlenecks or how we can help ease the bottlenecks. Is there like legislation or an approach we can take to minimize the regulations or make it easier for farmers to process their own animals if they choose to?
I think this is a big question I'm asking myself. And I want to say at the outset that I don't have all the answers. I have some thoughts. I think that legislation can move the dial. I was part of changing some legislation around poultry processing in Colorado 7, 8 years ago, where they had superseded federal guidelines for processing poultry on farm. And so it was trying to get them to actually adopt federal guidelines, and spent 3 years trying to move the needle, and it finally passed. And so I do think that that is one way that we can get involved. And it's important to note that legislation is different from state to state. I know that this is something we talked about prior, that there is both state processing and there's USDA processing, and some states will have both and some will just have USDA processing. And this is absolutely something to get involved with. And there are some incredible examples in.
Okay, I can take that off my own track, but I was going to cough. All right, you were saying there's some incredible examples.
Yeah, there's some incredible examples being set in Wyoming, which has very liberal laws around processing and who it can be sold to and where it was processed. And there's also an incredible example. We were talking about this, and it's either North or South Dakota, but it's where Dan O'Brien with Wild Idea Buffalo Company is, where he is able to shoot his bison on the farm in the field and then has a certain number of hours to transport them to the USDA facility for them to be further processed. And so I think that legislation is one piece, and I'll say this because it's just true. I think that every part of the food system needs more capital. It needs more funding. And that's a difficult thing to say, but I think that as we're looking at building more environmental sustainability, more health sustainability, we have to talk about financial sustainability and investment for some of these crucial aspects of our food system.
So if I were ready to donate and or raise money, some capital as you're describing, who would I give it to?
Whew. Well, I mean, you'd start talking to some local processors, start talking to people that might be in need. I mean, that's such a great question. I think you would just start by talking to your local farmers, see where they're processing their food, talk to those processors, see where you might be able to help, and to begin that conversation.
So when you say talk with the local processors, it is cool. And it does sound different to me because we're always saying, get to know your farmer, know your farmer. So this is a little shift. But I
Yes,
want to
and I do
go
want
ahead.
to say just really quick,
Yeah.
it can be a closed space. There isn't a lot of trust there. And I think that with people that look to film these things or expose them, and PETA, like, this is a community that can be a little bit more closed, and a little bit less trusting. And so building relationships is important in that regard.
And that takes us to one of my favorite lines that is like a hallmark of Kate Kavanaugh, as far as I can tell, is that everything is relationship. It's all about relationships. Can you explain to us something of the network or the web of the food system that kind of confirms that trademark saying of yours?
Yeah, I really like to explain this to people with the idea of minerals, right? And it's this idea that everything happens in relationship. And we've already kind of talked about it with our breath and with the way that our food that was once other becomes us. But another way to look at this is to look at the way that minerals traverse throughout the universe, really. And the idea that all the elements that make up our earth came out of the Big Bang, out of the singularity, and were made rocks by the action of deep time here on Earth. And contained in those rocks are the elements of magnesium and zinc and copper and all of these different pieces. And inside the soil food web, you have this beautiful collaboration of all these different entities, these micro animals, microarthropods. You have 1 billion microorganisms per single teaspoon of soil, 10 billion viruses. And this works as this concert to liberate these minerals from these rocks using mostly mycorrhizal fungi and the action of earthworms. And then those minerals are part of the nutrients that are exchanged at the root of a plant, which is just thought to be the fungal symbiont of a rootless green algae. And so again, right, like this relationship that happened that formed this plant early on in time. So they're exchanged at the root of the plant, and then that plant has this relationship with the sun where it's converting the energy from the sun inside of its chloroplast, which again, under Lynn Margulis's endosymbiotic theory, is the engulfing of a single-celled organism of another single-celled organism, where they became something that were happening in collaboration. And so that's part of what creates the carbohydrates and sugars that it exchanges at the plant root in relationship, in reciprocity, for these minerals that then become a part of plant tissues that animals then eat, like ruminants, like the cattle or the goats that we've been talking about, and then traverse through their digestive system, where you have, I think it's 150 billion microorganisms per single teaspoon of rumen fluid. And so inside that rumen, which is their stomach, their four-chambered stomach, you have a symbiotic relationship actually with the fungi and bacteria that are there that produce the enzyme that breaks down plant tissues. So again, like this is happening in relationship, and then it goes and it becomes a part of that animal in the phytochemicals and the meat and the fat that we've been discussing. And then we eat that, and that other becomes a part of self. And then in our cells and in the cells of those ruminants, we're making ATP inside of our mitochondria, which are just like those chloroplasts. It's this ancient relationship that happened between two single-celled organisms that decided to work together in relationship. And I think that the more that you take this lens of looking at the world, you can see this beautiful component of collaboration and how other builds self, and of everything unfolding in relationship.
Oh, that's so beautiful and so well described. It's so magnificent. And for those listeners who come from a Christian framework like me, don't be put off by the Big Bang thing. You can just imagine that it's the creator setting things in motion and designing it all to intricately dance together in a way that is of benefit, and a creator that wants to be in relationship with us. I mean, it's really fascinating
Absolutely.
when you look at things also from a spiritual lens, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, and that's beautiful. I think that this is something that can fit into any belief framework. And I think really describes that relationship that we have with something greater than ourselves, whether you call that God, whether you call that universe, whether you call that source, whether you just call that being a human woven into this earth at this particular point in time.
Well, Kate, another thing I like, speaking of relationship, is the way you've started a farm finder. And I want to give you a minute to talk about that, because that's helping us improve a relationship. Some people listening might not even know a single farmer in their area, right? So talk
Yeah.
to us about how you wanted to meet that need.
Yeah, so this is called Near Home, and I know that there are a lot of farm finders out there, but I built this in conjunction with my friend Anthony Guston, and it is all about finding a farm near your home that really meets your standards. And so everything on there is, to the best of our abilities, 100% grass-fed and grass-finished ruminants, pasture-raised pork and poultry, but you can search by certifications if you're looking for something that's biodynamic, or you're looking for something that's American Grass-Fed Association certified. You can search by that. You can search for low poofa. You might not find any near you because that hasn't picked up as much traction. You can search by different species and really connect to a farmer, because I think that there's a deep need for us to, again, be in relationship with the people that grow our food, and the people that grow our food need those relationships to support their business models.
That's beautiful. And we'll definitely put a link in the show description so people can find that near home platform that you've created. That's fantastic. And you mentioned low poofa. Let's just address that a little bit before we close. What does that term mean, and how can you make sure your meat is low poofa?
Yeah, and I want to say at the outset of this that I don't think that this is the single most important metric. Like I still eat meat that has been fed corn, soy, sunflower at times, and so I don't. One of my goals is to not let us get hung up on perfection being the enemy of the good. And so I think that eating meat, it confers a lot of benefits. And so it doesn't have to fit this mold of perfection. But I think that we've seen throughout, and I'm sure you've talked about this on the podcast, but we've seen the rise of polyunsaturated fatty acids. These are PUFAs. And that is our omega-6 fat, or our linoleic acid. And the ratio that we would have had for most of human history of omega-3s, we see more of these in fish, in grass-fed ruminants, to omega-6s is 1-to-1, maybe 1-to-2, and now we're sitting at about a 1-to-16 to 1-to-23, it depends on where you look, ratio, and it has a lot of health implications, especially because these make up a lot of our cell membranes, and so it changes the way that our cell membranes behave and has a lot of ramifications that we won't get into. But my husband and I have been experimenting on our farm with raising low poofa pork and poultry. And so even pasture raised poultry, because they have a single stomach just like us, require some feed inputs. And those usually have corn, soy, or sunflower, which are really rich in these omega-6 fatty acids, these PUFAs. And so we've been raising our pigs and our chickens and our ducks and our geese on a low poofa feed that we actually sprout, which again is going to further reduce anti-nutrients that are going to bind to minerals like zinc, and prevent them from getting that full nutrition. And seeing what it would take and whether or not we could also do it in a way where our feed was the same price as that with corn and soy, or even a little bit less expensive, because I think that it's really important as we, I don't want to say innovate in the food system because these are all very old ideas, but as we come to some of these things that we're building, again, financial sustainability for farmers and ranchers.
Wow, thanks for clarifying that point. And you're right, I think it's important not to become too fearful
Yes.
of the food we consume, but remembering it's all about relationship and
Yes.
understanding that we are very complex beings. So this has been an amazing conversation. I'm so thankful. I literally hate to wrap it up, but we can continue on a little bit in the mini-so. But for now, Kate, tell us, if the listener could just do one thing to improve their health, one thing, what would you recommend that they do?
I would recommend that they find connection with some aspect of their food system that is resonant with them. Go shake the hand of your farmer, of your processor. Grow an herb in your garden. Go hold a handful of soil and imagine just how rich it is with life.
Beautiful words to end on. Kate, thank you for the inspiration and the conversation. I loved it.
Absolutely, Hilda. It was such a pleasure.
So now we're going to keep going. We'll do the mini-so thing. And I think I might like to ask you a little bit more about, because they like it to be a little tangential. Let me see.
Mm-hmm.
I was thinking about going on about or talking about how we're bio-individual and how one modality might not work for another, unless you have something else that you're like, oh, I wish we would have talked about this.
Cooking is something that is one idea, but I'm happy to talk about the bio-individuality too, because I think that's actually, I think we're missing that in the conversation. Like, I think oftentimes that doesn't, we're like, oh, this is just going to work for, what works for them is going to.
Yeah, but cooking kind of is related more to this. So maybe we should just do cooking. Is that okay?
Yeah, either way.
All right, we'll just go cooking. Welcome to the mini-so, Kate.
It's such a pleasure to be here, Hilda.
Thank you for coming back, even though it was just a minute ago. That always makes me laugh. We literally didn't go anywhere. But anyway, okay. So one thing we did not touch on in the main interview is cooking, and how, I think I've heard you say, it lies at the heart of many of our issues right now.
Yeah.
Can you elaborate?
Yeah, I've really been thinking about how that we have stopped cooking as much at home. Really and to return to it would really influence three spaces that I think desperately need us to cook at home. And those three spaces are human health. And I think that your listeners are very familiar with all the ways in which human health is declining. And when we eat out, I think we are taking in a lot of ingredients that are hidden, a lot of sugars, a lot of seed oils that we might not know is in that food. And I think that's one thing that we can do. Or we're eating processed food, right? We're eating convenience foods in lieu of cooking that are going to be hyper palatable, hyper processed, full of these ingredients that we might not want in our bodies. And then I think it lies at the heart of regenerative farmers and ranchers farmers and ranchers across the United States are struggling. And this is something that I think is really important to talk about. They operate on average on 1.5% margins. This is not okay.
They're making very little for all the work they're putting in.
An average of 1.5% margins, which means that many farms and ranches are in the red. They are not making any money, and they are growing the most important part of our food system. And I really believe that if we return to cooking at home and building these relationships with the people that raise our food, that raise our meat, that raise our vegetables, that we can begin to build a more financially sustainable system. And I think that's really important, as well as the reciprocity in regenerative agriculture, building soil organic matter. And so it has both ramifications for the financial health of farmers and the health of soil and our land. And then that third piece is I think that we have become really deeply disconnected with one another. I think at multiple different scales, at the scale of the individual family unit, where having a meal at the dinner table can really bring us together, at the scale of our communities, where when we host a little get together potluck in our backyard where we're cooking for one another, we're connecting back into our communities. And I think that connection with one another is as much of a nutrient as anything that we're going to find in our food. And so I really believe that cooking lies at the heart of this little triangle that we're experiencing some fractures in.
Wow. Yeah. So you're saying that if we literally rolled up our sleeves and made more meals from scratch, we would see the benefit in our own health.
Yes.
We would be helping to revitalize the soil and farmers and ranchers' livelihood, and we would revitalize our community too.
Yes. That's my thought.
Wow, that's really, really interesting. And just it's a novel way to look at it. That's why I'm processing it out loud. If you were going to recommend to someone who eats out all the time, for example, I have friends in New York City who literally don't even have a kitchen because they're assuming New Yorkers are not going to cook from home or from scratch.
Yeah.
Like, what would be a simple meal to start with? What might be on your table one Thursday night, for example?
Yeah. So oftentimes on my table, whether it's for breakfast or dinner, is some ground beef or ground meat of some sort that has just been sauteed with some herbs, maybe a little bit of carrots or celery or a vegetable from my garden. And that's it. And I actually think that one of the biggest hurdles in cooking is that we've been sold this idea that cooking needs to be fussy or fancy by chefs and by restaurants. And I think if we can get back to this idea that it doesn't have to be precious, it can just be simple and nourishing, that is really helpful for those of us that need some convenience in our food. And I count myself amongst them, right? I run a podcast and a farm and a business. And so I need meals to be quick and easy and not take too much time. And you can literally just saute up some ground beef with a little bit of salt and call that good. And if you want to add some flourish and some herbs or some vegetables, great. But we can kind of let go of this idea of these more put together meals.
Yeah, that lowers the bar, and it's still super nourishing. I love that my friend Hillary Boynton always says, simplicity is gourmet.
I love that. That's beautiful.
It is. But I think one thing that came to mind when you were saying what has influenced us to think we have to get fancy, I think it's all the cooking TV shows too, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, it's celebrity chef culture. I think it's when you open up a cookbook from Thomas Keller and he's telling you to blanch celery before you add it to your chicken soup. Well, this is ridiculous. This is not made for people that lead busy lives and that want cooking to feel simple and accessible.
Well, I feel like you've helped us remember that truth. So thank you so much for joining me for this little mini-sode, and we really appreciate you, Kate.
Absolutely. I appreciate you so much, Hilda.